Hi guys. So let me take you through a few of the changes I've just made here. Nothing much. If you remember, I had some misbehaving point velocities on this middle sim, and that was the ones that the motion blur was stretching all the way down into the scene. So instead of just removing the velocity, what I did was in this color multiplier wrangle, I've added a clamp. So I just looked at the render and at the general velocity values and just made sure that they never peak above or below 5, and that seemed to control those ones that were overshooting. The only other thing I really changed, if you look, most of this is the same, but I had a problem, and the problem was every time I did a test render before frame 15, it was taking extremely long, and that's basically just to render this small area over here. I'll show you. So when the portal is basically as small as a dot before it's even opened up, I guess there was some very high velocity values, so that was making the motion blur take forever to render. So I've just put in a switch for each one of these, and I've removed velocity, and I put a switch here and said after frame 15 switch to the normal chain that does have velocity, and that fixed the render times here before frame 15. So at this point I think we're good to move on, and the first thing I wanted to do was just check the environment render. So if we just go to a frame like this, I'll put down a mantra, full frame, cam. I'll just do 2/3 resolution for now, and we'll leave everything else as default, I guess. And let's see how it looks. Make sure you're displaying the LUT. So that all seems to be fine. You can see the environment light is having an effect, and then I have a spotlight, which is just this subtle light in the foreground to kind of pick up the character as he runs forward. And I might just switch on the environment light, render light geometry, just so we can get ourselves a cheap sky. So that seems to be all good, and it's rendering pretty quick. So let's go ahead and make a light from one of the particle sims. Now the one thing is, because I'm working on a laptop and I don't have a render farm, I think I'll be splitting this up into more render layers than I usually would. So at work I'd probably try and get as much into one mantra render as I can, but for one, Magic kind of lends itself to having as many layers as possible for the comp anyway, and the second part of that is to save us time. So if I add a light for the portal affecting the environment, I'll split that into a separate mantra, and so that if we don't like the way the light works later on, that's the only pass I'll need to re-render instead of having to render the character and the environment again. So let's jump back into the portal here, and what I want is I want to take one of these particle layers. Let's take this one, and I just want to convert this into a polygon mesh. So let's do VDB from particles, and then before I even plug anything in, I'm just going to scale this point radius way down, because that's usually when you get some kind of crash if the P scale is too big. So we convert that, and then I'll convert that straight away into polygons. And just a note here as well, I found that if I'm converting like a polygon mesh into a VDB and doing some stuff and then converting it back into polys, the default ISO value is 0, and that always seems to have a slightly thinner result than the original mesh. So for me, I've found that if you just use the voxel size as the ISO value, you get the most accurate, accurate spacing. So like if I have a teapot and I convert it to VDB and then back to polys, my most accurate refit is using the same values for these two. So let's go a bit smaller here. And then what we want basically is we only need light where the portal is the brightest. So I'm expecting somewhere all around the inner circle, and then maybe some of the bright highlights to have our geometry. And as it goes dark, or as the alpha falls off, we can remove that from the mesh, and we don't need that to cast light. So let me take one of these P-scale angles and I'll put that in here. So now obviously our P-scale is very low. .01. And then what I want to do is basically multiply the P-scale by blue. So I'll put in here CDZ, see if that works. Yeah, so that works, and then I'll multiply it again, all of it, by the alpha. So I'm just trying to basically get rid of as much as possible and keep only what I need. So let's go back down. A bit higher resolution here. So that looks pretty good. If we look at that, it's kind of, you can see the highlights here in the point color are matching where our geometry is, and we have some of that geometry around the center circle as well. So that works for me. Let me just name this out of good habit. Right, and then what I'll do is just hit the geometry light. And I'll take you through my general lighting setup for this as well, which we have this pointing to our geometry, and we want this to be very specific. So what did I call it? Portal geolight. And I always just switch on transform into this object in case I end up moving this. That's all fine. We do need a bluish tint because we're not actually taking the point color. And in the attenuation settings, I pretty much always use active radius just to save on render time. And I also tie that value to the ramp. I don't know why it doesn't do that by default, but I want this ramp to fit within that range. So say we're down to 10. I want that fall off to match. So let me save. And let's try render this. So we've got a pretty subtle light there. Which we can obviously bring up in comp if I'm going to split it. So let me actually set that up now. So in our environment mantra, in objects, I'll make sure to exclude the portal light. So that's good for our environment render, and actually I'll set the character to be phantom because I'm going to keep him in a separate pass, but I want him to cast shadows on the environment. So this can be our straight environment mantra, and then we'll have one basically for like just the portal light, and this will be the same except that instead of all lights in candidate, we'll just force the portal light. So actually, with that in mind, I'm going to disable this light because we can just force it in the passes that we want. And let's try that. Luckily it's pretty quick to get these renders going, so I can pretty much test each one of these. So that's working, it's super dim. So we just want this to feel like it has a serious impact on the environment. And the nice thing about using that particle sim instead of just putting some disk is this light should actually change and flicker and cast different shadows over time because it's using the actual particles. So that looks pretty good. I mean, I might tweak this. That's good for now, and then what I'll do is I'll set up the same thing for the character. So I'll have just the character, and in objects I'll have, let me think about this, I'll have everything but I'll force matte the scene. And in this case I actually don't want the sky, so let's just switch that off again. So there's our character. I might change my mind later and we just include the environment and the character in the same render, but for now I know that these two will merge together fine. And then we'll have the character portal light. Once again, I could probably merge these two. So in this case we still want the portal geolight forced, and we want everything as a candidate, but we want to matte the scene. So in terms of lighting paths, I mean, we could set up some extra image planes to do this as well, I guess, but in this case, as long as there's no light affecting the environment or the character, and the only light enabled is the portal geolight, that gives us a perfect lighting path to use in comp. So I can just merge that on top. So that looks pretty good to me for the environment and the character. Let me save. Now, just to set up our mantras for the particles. So we know that I have 3 different layers here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a take for each one. So let's say particles A, oh, particles B, why don't I keep doing that? And particles C. So what I'll do is no matter which node is viewed here, I'll make sure to set my particles A take to portal A and particle B over there and C over there. So if we just double check that, if I click on this and I choose particle A, B, C. So that works. And apparently I've added a bunch of stuff in the main take. Not sure. Ah, that's fine. Yeah, that works. And then I'll just duplicate this mantra. So we'll say A, B, and C or something. And I'll just make sure, and I always do this, forget to set the take. So in my head I've already made the takes, but then I forget to actually change it here, and I end up with 3 identical render layers. So just make sure we set this take on these mantras, and that's it. So basically that should do it. So let's have a quick test of that. Before I end this video, because at this point basically we'll I'll maybe tweak the lights of the portal, but I'll be rendering all of this out, and we can jump in the next video and start to do our first version of the comp before we come back and add in any other layers I've been talking about. So right now I'm just checking that the takes are doing what they should be doing. And I'm just thinking I've forgotten to do something. So this looks fine. I have this problem because in the comp, this character is going to just be sitting there in space until he comes flying through. And I've thought of that now because, so these takes work because I actually need to add the character as a matte object. So we do want the character to matte out the particles. And that means, that might be fine for here, but definitely when we have the characters render, it's gonna get awkward to try and comp him out basically above this area. So what I'm thinking is just put down a geo and I'll object merge in the portal disk that we have. If I can remember what it's called. Portal shape. And we'll just take this move. So that should match up. Oh, it doesn't. Oh, because we're using the bulge to just warp it into the scene. So I'll basically just eyeball this, I think. I mean, actually, that makes sense because we do want him to appear before he actually gets past this ring because we have that tunnel. So I'll just leave it there and I'll extrude. So just enough to cover him. And let me just make this a little bit bigger to be sure. So as long as we have that, oh, it's taking long because even with the portal light not visible, it still has to calculate all of that geo. So I'm usually always coming in here and just putting down like whatever. Yep, so that's cool. So he'll just sort of appear out of nowhere there as long as we include that matte object into the character passes. So we'll say force matte, matte. That should do. Right, so I think that's good for now. That's given us plenty to render. And what I'll do personally is actually connect these up. So say FX environment, FX character, then do the light for each one, and then go ahead and render each one of these particle layers. And in that case, you just right click on the last one. How do you do it again? No. You just click on the last one and go up here to controls and change this order to node by node and hit render. So that'll go all the way back up to this node, fully render all the sequence for that, move on, etc. So when I'm working at home, that's what I usually do. If I was on a farm, I would just submit all of them. So if you do have access to a render farm, you can do that, and that's great for you. Also, just remember to reset your resolutions for particles, especially. Make sure you have full res and probably at least 6 pixel samples. And that's it for now, so I'll see you in the next video.